right, let's move on to mission statement.
Mr. Jacobs submitted a couple slides. Do we want to address those now, Mr. Jacobs?
Sure. And given the time, I'm going to try to make this pretty short and sweet. But I did, in talking with, basically the last board meeting where we discussed several versions of the statement that were submitted by all of us, it just seemed to me that it was difficult to make progress. How are we going to decide, which one were better or whatnot? So what I did is basically just list all the statements that were submitted, initially just with a word count and basically where the source was. There was one statement that had sort of support from 2 board members. If you go to the next slide. So what you're seeing on the screen is basically the existing mission statement, 60 words, I think. But what I started to consider was to basically sort of color code what is it made out of? What does this statement say? And if you go to the next slide, if you apply this, you can sort of see how that 60-word statement answers a broad series of questions from the who, how, why, and so forth. So it's just a visual way of actually sort of saying what's in there. What are we talking about? Because we're discussing about how to potentially change it. So if you go to the next slide, if I apply that same color coding method to all the ones that were submitted, you basically start to see sort of trends of what they are, what they prioritize or what they leave off, what they suggest to boil it down to. And if you go to the next slide, so just as a way to maybe zoom out a little bit, I mean, a number of us, when we ran for these positions to be on the board, certainly including myself, we said that we believed that a robust discussion about strategic planning was very important. For my involvement with strategic planning, I mean, those 2 words, strategy basically answers the question of how are you going to do it? And I just included the quote from Eisenhower, which I've always loved from the moment I first saw it, that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And so I've always felt like, yes, we're at this moment we're discussing about changing the mission statement potentially, but the actual dialogue, other than a Saturday, strategic planning session that we had, is very cumbersome because we have to do it here, and we should do it here, of course. But the reason we're talking about potentially changing the mission statement is because it is a foundational statement that's part of strategic planning. So if you go to the next one, on the next slide, I sort of thought it might be interesting to show a quick timeline, because as we all know, we're elected officials for 4 years at each time, with half of us, it's sort of overlapping. Mm-hmm. And I think what's really important to consider is that when we talk about changing the prior mission statement, it's also, I think we should have prior boards in mind who created it. And we should also keep in mind that all of us are going to be here for various periods of times, but eventually we're all going to be replaced. And so I believe that for a high school like this, a certain amount of, not consistency, but sort of even precedent should be considered. And my hope would be that our strategic planning discussions really set a framework that will be also useful to future boards. My point is, the primary audience for a mission statement, in my opinion, is current and future board members. Yes, it would be nice if members of the community could remember it, but that's not going to happen as far as unless it were like a little tagline. But I think it's really quite important to consider that timeline and the fact that a mission statement potentially answers to multiple questions. So if you go to the next. A high school mission statement is inherently complex. If you say we need to go to the moon by the end of the decade, which happened, the 60s, that's certainly, then you can have a mission statement that's really short, just like that. Let's go to the moon, and it's sufficiently narrow, and you can go very deep with it. But considering the complexity of issues that we deal with, as evidenced by the board meeting tonight, I think it's actually. I can't even remember what I wrote there. Education today. Yeah, the idea that the focus inherently ought to be broader. Exactly. So if you go to the next one, thank you, Deanna. So the second to last, I'm almost done. I personally feel that it's not just a personal feeling. I think the responsibility of us as board members is to set the conditions by setting policy and so forth that set the growth conditions of this organization. I mean, it's like we decide in this example, what the coverage is and how much water and all these, it's a complex thing. And if you go to the last one, from personal experience, and other people have written about this in the business world and so forth, if you really want to do this somewhat rigorously, the question about what is timeless, what's sort of on the values level that will never change, and what are the things that are up for discussion that we should actually rigorously challenge about how education might develop. I mean, this is just a very useful framework to have this discussion. So, sorry for the long-winded statement, but after having looked at all of our proposed statements, I think they're perfectly fine first drafts. But when I look at them now and I compare them to the existing mission statement, I actually think the existing mission statement is just as good, potentially actually better in my mind than many of the ones submitted, because especially the ones that go to really short statements, my concern is that they end up saying nothing. That yes, it's a short statement, but they don't really address the how we should set up this environment for growth for everyone. And so I'm reluctant to, I don't know exactly what the next step might be, other than I would suggest that it may be, I would be a little worried about sort of trying to come to a conclusion so that we can say we changed the mission statement when I'm not convinced that we've had deep enough conversation, and this could happen a couple of months from now or whatever. I'm not saying we should stop the discussion, but I'm not convinced that we are ready to say, oh, now let's take a vote on these 5, and the one that gets the most. I would not be in favor of that and would vote accordingly.
When Tom brought this up to me, I wholly agreed. We don't need to change something just for the sake of change, if it's that good. And we have to rethink about it. And what are we trying to accomplish? Is it to get a better, hipper tagline, or is it to educate the next generation of people to the best of our ability? And to Tom's point of the framework, and I just read a little bit of the existing one is, in a safe, orderly, well-equipped environment. Nothing else that addresses that, there's a piece in there that we have to take care of. This building is just as important as anything else, because this building is where they learn. This, where we are today in the Alumni Lounge, is a great example of, we spent some money to make it a blended learning room to really go to the next generation of learning, right? And that's the, I guess, whatever color that is. I'm not good at colors, but
I would suggest, I like how you took the original and you color coded it. I think that's fantastic. And then if we took the 4 that were here and you looked at the first one and said, is there anything of the first one that is uniquely important that we might want to add or swap out from the original? So maybe there's a piece or a nugget from each of the new ones that you might want to replace with the original. Because there's probably a lot of redundancy. You know, and so if you look at 2, which is very short, you could say, is there a nugget in 2 that is not in the original? And then you could take that nugget and put it in the original and say, was there something in the original that's just kind of antedated, and just take that out and kind of do it that way and see if you've gotten something new that, you know, has evolved over, you know, from time, and you haven't lost what was foundational.
So what are some of our next steps? I guess, I think if you're willing, maybe you could take the current one and wordsmith it or not. Give us a couple ideas.
So I mean, I pulled our notes from when we sat in this room, right, for a long day on mission statement day. I mean, the feedback from not just us, but members of the community we had here, the current one felt generic and too long, should be more succinct, need to talk about a diverse world. Language needs to be updated, it's too wordy, some of the language is dated, needs to be revised. So there were some of those notes, and I think the other examples we're trying to, maybe this is what we were saying, is to almost modernize it a little bit. But we did get some tangible feedback from that exercise that I'd hate to lose.
The next steps, whatever the board decides to do, whether it's shorten it or try to combine it or look, I do think we should have a draft or 2 that go back to the
Yes.
group that volunteered in February. I think there were 10 or 15 community members, 2 or 3 teachers, the administrators. I think whatever that group is, I think we should show them that wasn't for nothing. You know, and so I do think there was that was part of the executive summary by the group that we brought in, that was the feedback from the data. So
I think we need to work on it at a meeting. We can't keep saying we'll do a draft. I think we just need to pull it up on the board there.
well, I just think the timing, right? Like, we only have one meeting in July and August. We're in the middle of a global pandemic and trying to figure out how to open school,
Yeah.
right? Like, I don't know.
We got some other priorities.
Just the timing isn't the best right now. But I don't think it's a bad idea to, I mean, we have 3 people. Somebody else submitted a vote that they could go with 5. So should we look at number 5? You know, should we pull off the other 2 options or see if there's a way to combine 5 with the other 2 options? You know, we should try to figure out, or maybe have someone on the board try to figure out a way to kind of cut the list from what we submitted, which in the notes I submitted, I believe there were votes for, back to the original page on 21 was, Wes had number 7, Gina and Bill had the second part of 5. Ramona said she can do 6 or 5. Deanna had 3, Tom had 4. Like, well, should we, you know, eliminate 6 and vote, you know, 3 people had 5? Is there a way to combine some of these just to get it down to at least 2?
But we're still missing the discussion. What if we said our next board meeting, we would meet a half hour before the board meeting, anybody who wanted to come a half hour prior?
We just have to post that because it's more than 2 board members.
Right, that's what I mean. So the next board meeting, if we said a half hour prior to the board meeting, we'll put it up and we'll have that discussion and start to
Yeah.
wordsmith it.
I mean, again, that will be August, so I'll be bringing you how we're going to go to school in a global pandemic. We're going to have some
Right.
curriculum updates on graduation requirements. It's not going to be another short meeting.
Right, but
So
that's
whatever
why,
happens at that August meeting, I would say we limit it to that first half hour, right? And then we can touch on it again in
well,
September.
it would be special. It'd be 6:30 to 7, so not everybody has to come to that if they don't want to. So any board member who wanted to come and have that discussion, but I think it needs to be discussed, not this, let's submit it, let's combine it, and then we come back and we're still at a standstill. I mean,
Agreed.
somebody could lead that, let's put it up and spend a half hour, maybe we'll get closer, maybe we'll say, hey, this is great. And then when the board meeting starts, you could show this is how far we got, should we do more, or you want to think about
Bad
it?
idea.
All right. Yeah,
Do we want Mary Ann to schedule that?
yeah, let's have Mary Ann schedule
I mean,
that.
are you thinking that the
my
August
only
meeting is
question
gonna
is-
be like an 11 PM meeting though?
Sure.
Like,
Sure.
Yeah, might be.
that's the only.
You're talking,
thing.
again, global pandemic. Gonna spend
Could we
some-
schedule like a special meeting where one day you post
Yeah.
a special meeting and
Yeah.
we just talk about the mission? And maybe it's an
You
hour and then we're done?
absolutely could do that.
Yeah.
Because I agree with Laura, I think that we do have to have discussion, but I agree with you that like global pandemic, big, huge things that we
Global
also have to
pandemic,
discuss.
You're gonna have the graduation discussion, which I would imagine is gonna take some
Right.
time, and then you're gonna have some things, who knows what will happen in the next 4 weeks.
So I
So
mean,
what
I would be
say
open
to you
to
is
a
there's only one
separate.
in August, so if you're gonna schedule a special meeting, I would do it after August, the August board meeting before the September board meeting.
Right.
When we're kinda getting back into school.
I mean, would you
I'm
guys
happy
be
to do
open to
that.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could also do this at 7:30 in the morning, from 7:30 to 8, and just call it a board committee on the mission statement, so that people could come before work, and then this way it forces you to talk for a half hour and leave. It's open to the public if they want to, but you don't have to have the quorum.
Yeah.
You don't have to do some of the formal things of having Mary in there to do,
Yeah.
you do that as well.
I think we need to have the conversation. I think
I
it's a
agree.
great idea to have a special meeting. Not everybody has to come if
Yeah.
you can't. But I believe as board members,
I'd call it the mission committee. Let me get back to you with some suggestions. Let me talk to Wes.
Yeah.
'Cause I think you should do it after the August meeting.
yeah,
Yeah.
Right, because I think
Okay.
a lot of attention is going to be on this pandemic the next
Yep.
couple of
Right.
weeks, even
Yep.
from your guys' work and at the developments in the state.
Mm-hmm.
But it might be better to call this a board committee on the mission statement. And then that could meet, because if you call it a special meeting of the board and there's no quorum, you can have discussion, you just can't take any action, I believe, is the way. And there's some of those Roberts rules I got to check.
yeah, and so that way, I mean,
And that
it was
could go
great, you
in-
put it
in
up
the
there,
next
and then you could
phase.
look at these, and you talk about what's important, you talk about the comments. That's all we do for the evening, but it
Sure.
needs to be discussed.
Yeah, and then we could just bring the summary to a regular meeting.
Yeah.
Sure.
Right, we don't have to take any action, it's just
Right.
discussion.
Yeah, that's a
Right.
good idea. And thank you, Tom, because with all the color, it's a new way
Yeah,
of
it
looking at
was,
it that I
yeah,
hadn't thought of.
Yeah.
That I agree with Laura, like, you know, you kind of have to wrap your head around it, so a different time to discuss it.
Yeah.
I think is.
Yeah,
very
and I think what
worthwhile.
the discussion makes me happy because I was just nervous about rushing into something with just like, let's pick one. That's
Yeah.
No, and then
not
we
good,
could
right?
take
Yeah.
each one of these and say, is there the nugget? And then we
Right.
could take the comments that Deanna said, you know, are we picking something that's current that was resonating with the people who came to that meeting? But we have to have the discussion.
All right.
All right, that's good. So we're going to get back to an idea to be later in August. Additional discussions. At this point in the meeting, Board of Education members may request to add an additional discussion item. All right, my left.